The tools needed to service the Medgyne Cryo Probe include a utility knife, a Phillips head screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, a small needle nose pliers, a small optical screwdriver, a 7/16 open-end wrench, a half-inch open-end wrench, a soft bristle brush, a small punch, and a small hammer. To begin servicing the Medgyne Cryo Probe, you will first need to remove the 3 labels located on the handle of the probe. You will then need to remove the 4 screws that hold the handle together. Remove the screws and set them aside. Using the utility knife, gently separate the hand case as shown. Remove the valve body from the hand case and set the case aside. You will now need to remove the trigger assembly from the valve body. Remove the 4 screws that attach the trigger to the valve body. There are 2 screws on each side. You will also be removing the ground wire as shown. Next, you will need to carefully remove the pins from the trigger. Using the small punch and the hammer, gently remove the pins. Please make sure not to damage the trigger while using the punch. Align the punch over the pins and tap gently until the pins pop out. Remove the trigger and set it aside. Next, remove the 2 brass fittings as shown. This will disconnect the tube assembly. Remove the jacket probe by unscrewing the brass fitting. Remove the probe shaft and set aside. Next, remove the plug inlet as shown. Remove the delivery tube, sliding it back throughout the valve body. Next, pull out the push rod, along with the regulator and the spring. Remove the valve seat as shown. Next, remove the remainder of the two brass fittings. Remove the high pressure collar. The piston actuator spring will also be removed once the high pressure collar is unscrewed. Next, carefully pull the piston actuator from the valve body. Do not use a pliers to remove the piston actuator. Now inspect the ports on the valve for contamination and debris. You will now need to push the piston through the valve body as shown. Unscrew and remove the brass high pressure guide. And then remove the two number 3 silicone O-rings as shown. Again, inspect all the ports on the valve body, looking for contamination. You will see either a white contamination or a brownish-green sediment, which is caused by dirt particles from inside the tank. To clean the ports, rinse with a mild soapy water and scrub with a small, soft bristle brush. Please note that the valve body and the parts must be completely dry before assembling. Next, inspect the exhaust filter located on the yoke cylinder. If the filter is brown or black, it needs to be replaced. To replace the filter, simply unscrew it from the cylinder. And then inspect the port and clean with a soft bristle brush if necessary. Replace the exhaust filter if needed, making sure not to over-tighten. You will now need to remove the silicone O-ring and the white Teflon ring on the push rod and the piston actuator. Start with the push rod, which is shown here on the right. Remove the two split rings and the O-ring. Next, clean the push rod with an alcohol swab, making sure to remove all debris. Next, remove the two O-rings and the white Teflon split ring from the piston actuator and clean it with an alcohol swab. Next, inspect the regulator for contamination and clean with an alcohol swab, making sure to remove all debris. Now replace the split ring and the O-rings on the piston actuator, exactly as is shown here. When finished, the split ring should sit in between the two silicone O-rings. Please make sure not to damage, cut, or nick the O-rings or the split ring. Next, replace the O-rings and the split ring on the push rod exactly as is shown. First, replace the split ring. Then the silicone O-ring. And then the final split ring. The O-ring should sit between both split rings. Next, you will need to replace the number 3 silicone O-rings in the clean and dry valve body. Make sure the O-rings sit flat in the valve body. Use the optical screwdriver to sit them properly if needed. And then replace the pressure guide screw. Tighten the screw and insert the clean piston. Drop the piston into the port on the valve body and push it through. Next, replace the piston actuator by pushing it into place. You may need to use gentle force to get the piston in place. Drop down the actuator spring and replace the high pressure collar, only tightening a few threads. Do not tighten the high pressure collar all the way. Next, replace the valve post on the valve body and tighten it. You can now go back to the high pressure collar and tighten it until it is slightly raised above the valve body. Next, align the hole in the piston actuator so that it is straight as shown here. And you are now ready to reassemble the trigger assembly. First, gently tap the pins into the trigger, just enough to get them started. And then install the trigger on the piston actuator. Next, replace the regulator spring. Then drop down the regulator, making sure the needle side goes in first. Align the second hole to the trigger and install the pin. Move the latch system up and down to make sure that it is working. When you secure the latch to the valve body, make sure it is in the off position and do not yet tighten the screws. You'll now need to replace the two brass hose fittings, but first you must replace the Teflon tape on the threads of both fittings. Now replace the tube fittings. Next, carefully replace the number 3 O-ring on the delivery tube. Replace the delivery tube through the valve body and reinstall the plug inlet. Install the jacket probe and tighten the brass fitting. Now reconnect the tube assembly and tighten the fittings. Install the ground wire on the bottom right screw of the trigger. Pull the latch on the backside and tighten the screws. Make sure that all 4 screws on the trigger assembly are tight. Replace the valve body and the handle case. Make sure the tubing does not get crimped or cut by the handle when closing. Replace the 4 screws on the handle